France once dominated Europe, was a cultural superpower, the language of diplomats, and the envy of every court. Within a few years, the king's head was in a basket, and tens of thousands of others followed him to the guillotine. Russia once stretched across a sixth of the planet, an empire of crowns, churches, and millions of obedient subjects. Within months, the royal family was shot in the basement and dumped in a shallow grave. Cuba once sparkled like the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean with its casinos, American tourism, and money pouring in. Within 2 years, the regime was gone, replaced by a one-party state that has ruled the island for 6 decades. 3 different countries, 3 different centuries, 3 different ideologies, but one identical model. And right now, in 2025, the United States is walking the same 6-stage pat one step at a time, one pressure at a time. Not in that direction. Already inside. Under that model, America is not in early warning mode. It is in phase 4. I've spent over 10 years studying economic history, political collapse, and the numbers behind revolutions. And what I'm about to present to you is not an emotional prediction. It is one bicycle. This happened in France, in Russia, and in Cuba. Economists might call it structural failure. Historians call it revolutionary wave. I'll call it this. One 6-step-off switch built into every empire that refuses to repair itself. The only real question is, where is America on that timeline? And how much time is left before everything changes? 2. What is real revolution? When most people hear the word revolution, they picture smoke and fire. Streets full of protesters, police barricades, petrol bombs. A few windows are broken, a few cars are burned, maybe a new party will come to power and life will go on. That is not what a revolution. What a terrible weekend. A revolution is something much deeper and more dangerous. That's when a country's current operating system, its laws, rulers, institutions, unwritten rules are not patched, but deleted. Old software has been removed, new software has been installed, and the people who do the installation are almost never moderate. Revolution is when the court has no meaning anymore. Elections, if they still exist, are just a form of show. The police and the military are not under the same chain of command. Property ownership can be lost with just a signature or a gunshot. That was the moment when force replaces trust as the glue that holds society together. And here's the first misconception we must clear. Revolutions do not happen just because people are poor. People have lived in poverty for most of history without overthrowing their rulers. What was the driving force behind the revolution? Something else. Psychological limit point. Revolutions break out when expectations often exceed reality. They say they live in a great country, but they can't afford food, housing, or health care. The gap between the elite and the rest became clear and embarrassing. On one side of the river is the palace. On the other side is the slum. Private jets on Instagram, overdraft fees in your banking app. People lost faith that the system could repair itself. When courts seem rigged, elections seem meaningless, and corruption seems untouchable. People stop complaining and start hoarding anger. There's a famous quote by John F. Kennedy that summarizes the math behind it, not in the exact words, but the idea. When a system prevents peaceful change, it makes violent change inevitable. You can think of it like creating pressure in a boiler. Only when there is a release valve, real reform, real justice can the system survive. When the valve is welded closed, the pressure does not disappear. It's just waiting for something to crack. The refrigerator is empty. Landlords increase rents faster than wages. Hospitals charge up to 5 figures for simple procedures. The news shows politicians yelling at each other, but nothing changes. People feel it long before they can explain it. They feel that the rules no longer apply for people in senior positions. They feel like fools when they play with them, and that's when history stops being calm and starts rhyming. 3 completely different countries, France, Russia, and Cuba, all pass through 6 identical stages. Extreme wealth, inequality, corrupt and incompetent government. The middle class is crushed and becomes radicalized. Loss of faith in institutions. Revolutionary movements received popular support. The old regime collapsed, chaos and a new dictatorial order. Once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. So, let's go back to where the modern version of this script was first written in a fragrant palace, overlooking a capital city that reeked of hunger. 1. France, the elegant time bomb. In the late 1700s, France was center of gravity for Europe. The greatest thinkers all wrote in French. The most sophisticated courts copied the French style. The wealthiest nobles tried to imitate Versailles, but often failed. From the outside, this place looks like the final stage of civilization. From the inside, it looks like a time bomb set too soon. 1. Extreme wealth inequality. French society was officially divided into 3 estates. The first real estate, bishop-abbot church hierarchy. Monday, noble-duke, earl-nobleman. Tuesday, all others are farmers, city workers, merchants, lawyers, professionals. A small group of priests and nobles controlled a large area of land and paid almost tax-free. The entire tax burden fell on the third estate. Peasants who could barely afford bread, shopkeepers who could go bankrupt with just one bad harvest, and an emerging middle class angry that their money did not bring them power. Bread is not a snack. For the average farmer, it is the source of almost their entire food budget. So when bad weather ruined crops and grain prices skyrocketed, the price of bread doubled. Imagine your rent and food costs both doubled in 1 year, while your income remained the same. In the countryside, people starved to death. At Versailles, the chandeliers are still on. The gap is not just about income, but also about reality, is the first fracture. 2. Corrupt and incompetent government. Louis XVI is not a cartoon villain. He was worse than a man in crisis, hesitant, withdrawn, and indecisive. France incurred huge debts from financing wars abroad, including helping its American colonies escape Britain. Awesome in theory, but financially suicidal in practice. The math is simple. State debt, huge amount of money. The upper class refused to pay their fair share of taxes, and the king was unwilling to force them. So instead of uprooting the system that was killing the country, the court tried to crack patch, borrow more, increase certain taxes on those who cannot afford to pay, pray that anything will save them. The nobility saw the numbers. They know the country is in trouble, and they still choose to protect their privileges over the survival of the state. This is the sign of a ruling class on the brink of extinction. They would rather let the ship sink than give up their first-class cabin. 3. The middle class is destroyed and becomes radicalized. This is the stage where a bad situation becomes a revolutionary situation. It is true that farmers are suffering, but educated middle-class lawyers, businessmen, and experts were furious. They are paying taxes. They are working. Politically, however, they are considered secondary furniture. As the crisis became undeniable, the king convened the Council of All Estates, for the first time in nearly 2 centuries. His goal, to convince the country to accept the new tax. Instead, he lit a fire. Representatives of the third class appeared, with notebooks full of complaints and a new sense of self. They asked why 98% of the population must be vaccinated, same number of votes as a small elite group. The answer above is basically, because things have always been like this. So, Rank 3 did something unheard of. They stepped outside. They met on an indoor tennis court, locked the doors, and vowed not to disperse until France had a new constitution. That was that moment. Those who should have stabilized the system, the educated, tax-paying middle class, decided that it was illegal. Once that group reverses, revolutions move from theoretical to scheduled. 4. Loss of faith in institutions. In July 1789, rumors spread that the king was about to use the army to suppress the new National Assembly. Paris reacted with fear, and then anger. Crowds stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress and symbol of royal power. They killed the guards, confiscated their weapons, and destroyed the building stone by stone. You can almost mark this day on the calendar. Fear has changed sides. The monarchy, the church, the old courts, all the pillars that had supported French life for centuries were suddenly seen as corrupt, outdated, or official enemies. Once people believe, the system cannot fix itself. The system is the problem. Every organization that has ever maintained order becomes a target. 5. The revolutionary movement received the support of the people. The first wave of revolutionaries wanted a constitutional monarchy and some basic rights. They were moderate, cautious, and too slow for a starving population. The radicals stepped into that void. Groups like the Jacobin Club, led by men like Robespierre, promised moral purity and complete justice. No more half measures. No more compromises with enemies of the people. A new society built by upright people and protected by the guillotine. They came to power thanks to moderates. Unable to deliver fast enough, prices are still high, the economy is still weak. People want someone to blame and someone willing to do something about it. Radicals thrive in the space between anguish and disappointment. 6. Government overthrow. Chaos and dictatorship. Finally, the king was brought to trial and publicly executed. His wife followed, and so do tens of thousands of others. For about a year, France lived under the rule of reign of terror. Mass executions, show trials, neighbor denouncing neighbor. The revolution turned inward. First it killed the nobility, then it kills the moderates, kills its own creators. Robespierre himself suffered the same fate under the blade he had used to kill so many others. After a decade of chaos, war, and bloodshed, France was exhausted. Into that time of destitution, a military genius named Napoleon emerged, one who promised order, glory, and empire in exchange for absolute power. The revolution begins with words, liberty, equality, fraternity. The scene ends with a man in military uniform claiming to be the emperor. Lessons written into the timeline: extreme inequality, corrupt and incompetent government, a collapse of faith in institutions. Revolution. And revolution rarely leads to freedom. It usually leads to a new kind of cage. France is the first modern example of this six-stage cycle. It wasn't the last time, because just over a century later, on the other side of Europe, another empire was dreaming of following the same path, believing that because it was big, because it was old, because it was chosen, it would never fall. That is wrong. 2. Russia. The empire collapse from within Russia in the early 20th century seemed unshakable. A dynasty that ruled in 300 years, a vast empire stretching from Europe to the Pacific, a people that adheres to crown, church, and tradition. But inside, the same storm is forming that France experienced more than a century ago. And like France, Russia's rulers ignored all warnings. 1. Extreme wealth inequality. Russia is still fundamentally a feudal society. The nobility and royalty owned huge estates. The peasants, who made up about 80% of the population, owned almost nothing. Even after serfdom was abolished in 1861, life did not improve much. Farmers rent land they cannot afford. Many people live in huts with animals. Children have to work in the fields instead of going to school. In cities like Petrograd and Moscow, factory workers work 12-14 hours a day. No safety regulation salary is just enough to live on. Families lived in crowded barracks. Meanwhile, the Tsarist court held balls that cost more than a peasant's lifetime income. It's not just inequality, it is inequality, unable to move, the kind that causes despair, followed by rage. 2. Government corruption and incompetence. Nicholas II was raised to believe that he had a divine right to rule. He believed in tradition rather than reform, loyalty rather than merit. He ignored the warnings of his ministers, generals, and even his own relatives. What is his response to the growing discontent? Silence or bullets? In 1905, workers marched peacefully to the Winter Palace, hoping the Tsar would listen. His army opened fire. Hundreds of people died. Bloody Sunday shattered any faith the peasants still had in the monarchy. Then came World War I. A match was thrown into a barn filled with hay. Russia entered the war with a corrupt military leadership. There was virtually no modern industry. Soldiers were sent to the front lines without shoes, coats, or rifles. Supply lines collapsed. Whole divisions surrendered because they ran out of ammunition. 3 million Russian soldiers died. Millions more were deserted. The economy collapsed under the pressure. Meanwhile, the royal family still held balls, consulted mystics, and lived in luxury. The Tsar was not a bad man. He was simply incapable of ruling, the type of leader who cannot stop a revolution, because he does not understand the causes of the revolution. Back to the government. Revolutions do not begin when the poor are angry. They started when middle class and military stopped system protection. In February 1917, it happened. The women lining up to buy bread began to protest. Workers joined them. Soldiers were ordered to shoot into the crowd but refused. Some people rioted.